The clock is ticking. It is the night of the Ali Frazier fight in 1971. The streets are dead empty. A crowbar bites into the doorframe of a federal building in Pennsylvania. The shock is not the burglary. It is the bleeding casualty dragged into the light. 1,000 pages of stolen, classified files proving the United States government is running a lethal, illegal war against its own people on domestic soil. We are looking at a front line drawn through American living rooms. You think this is ancient history? You are wrong. The exact same infrastructure of paranoia, surveillance, and disruption that burned through the 1960s is now fully digitized and operating at the speed of light. If you do not understand how COINTELPRO operated, you do not realize that you are currently standing in the crosshairs of algorithmic psychological operations. Your data is the new battlefield. Ignorance of this history is your greatest, most fatal vulnerability today. We are handing you the decrypted enemy playbook. We will decode the exact tactical operations the state used to destroy civil movements from the inside out, utilizing military-grade psychological warfare on civilians. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented architecture of subversion. By the end of this hour, you will possess the armor to recognize modern state manipulation and psychological warfare before it neutralizes you. The survival briefing begins right now. The air in this claustrophobic, smoke-filled basement archive in Washington is thick with dust and institutional rot. A single, raw bulb swings overhead, casting harsh shadows. Through the eyes of a citizen investigator, gloved hands tremble not from the cold, but from the terrifying weight of the truth. They break the seal on a manila folder stamped with blood-red ink. Secret. Inside lies a typed memo from the desk of J. Edgar Hoover. It is a direct, undeniable order to open fire. The investigator's flashlight sweeps across the faded typewriter ink, illuminating words that shatter the illusion of a free society. The directive explicitly commands federal agents to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize American citizens. There is no mention of due process. There is no mention of a trial. This is a sanctioned hit list, drafted in the Capitol, treating the American populace not as a citizenry to be protected, but as an insurgency to be crushed. The offensive officially launches in the year 1956. The Bureau codenames it COINTELPRO, a sterilized abbreviation for Counterintelligence Program. Initially, the crosshairs are locked on the Communist Party, a convenient, terrifying enemy used to justify the deployment of wartime tactics within our own borders. But a weapon built for total control never stays pointed at just one target. The perimeter of paranoia rapidly expands, swallowing anyone who dares to question the system. The operation metastasizes into a massive, uncontrolled shadow war. The files detail more than 2,000 separate, highly illegal black bag jobs coordinated across the country. We are talking about unauthorized wiretaps bleeding into private bedroom conversations, midnight break-ins conducted by federal officers, and the systematic interception of personal mail. The investigator reads the logs, realizing the sheer, crushing volume of state-sponsored felonies committed under the cover of darkness. This domestic invasion requires massive logistical support, and the financing is an act of supreme betrayal. The budget for this kinetic shadow war is completely hidden from congressional oversight. Millions of dollars are silently siphoned from the public treasury. The state is literally weaponizing the people's own money against them, funding the systematic sabotage and destruction of the very taxpayers who are unknowingly underwriting their own subjugation. The corruption is absolute. In the field, Agents are briefed to operate with extreme prejudice. The investigator turns the page, finding operational field manuals that look less like law enforcement protocols and more like counterinsurgency doctrines from a foreign occupation. Standard rules of engagement are entirely suspended. Civil rights are treated as a bureaucratic inconvenience to be bypassed. This is no longer a police force investigating crimes. It is a phantom military executing a scorched earth campaign. The documents prove the creation of a literal domestic battlefield. Entire neighborhoods, university campuses, and local community centers are mapped out as hostile territories. The objective is not to gather evidence for a court of law, but to induce a state of permanent, crippling paranoia within target organizations. By planting rumors, forging letters, and creating artificial friction, the Bureau engineers a self-destruct mechanism within the heart of any dissenting political movement. The deeper the investigator digs into this subterranean archive, the more the horrifying scale of the architecture reveals itself. COINTELPRO is not a rogue mistake made by a few overzealous agents. It is a meticulously engineered, bureaucratic machine operating with the cold, calculated precision of a slaughterhouse. Every illegal wiretap, every fabricated threat, every destroyed reputation is part of a grand design to maintain absolute, unquestioned authority over the American mind. We are staring at a system that has fundamentally inverted its own mandate. When the apparatus of state security becomes entirely untethered from the law it is supposed to uphold, the line between the protector and the predator instantly vanishes. The investigator holds a document authorizing the destruction of a human life, realizing that the greatest threat to American liberty is not an invading army, but the men sitting in federal offices just a few blocks from the White House. This is the ultimate, terrifying paradox of protection. The evidence laid bare on this basement table forces a complete recalibration of reality. The very agency sworn by oath to protect and defend the United States Constitution is operating as an unchecked, extra-legal death squad. If the Guardians have become the assassins, and the law itself is weaponized to crush dissent, how does a free society survive the enemy within? The answer lies buried in the blood-stained files that follow. The blood-stained files of a bureaucratic slaughterhouse lead us directly to a sterile, brightly lit hotel room. Listen closely to the silence. Beneath the hum of the air conditioner, there is a distinct, rhythmic click echoing through the telephone receiver. A copper wire splice is instantly converting a private sanctuary into a live combat zone. This is the front line of a shadow war, and the enemy is already inside the walls. 200 feet below, parked in a damp alleyway, a reel-to-reel tape recorder spins relentlessly inside an unmarked surveillance van. To the undercover operative hunched over the glowing dials, the smell of ozone and stale coffee is suffocating. This is paranoid exhaustion, disguised as national security. Every intercepted whisper, every muffled footstep is logged, analyzed, and weaponized to authorize the next devastating strike. We are no longer looking at abstract policy memos. We are tracking a guided missile locked onto the moral compass of the American civil rights movement. The state security apparatus has determined that raw influence is a kinetic threat. When a single voice has the power to mobilize millions, that voice is classified as hostile artillery, and the directive from the director's desk is absolute. That artillery must be dismantled at all costs. But how do you completely neutralize a globally recognized icon without turning him into a martyr? A public execution only amplifies the message and triggers a societal explosion. To win this war, the state must orchestrate a much darker, invisible assassination. You do not fire a single bullet from a grassy knoll. Instead, you apply such crushing psychological pressure that the target reaches for the weapon and pulls the trigger himself. This is the anatomy of a psychological strike. In the year 1964, the Bureau prepared a devastating delivery for Martin Luther King Jr. It was an anonymous package, completely untraceable, arriving like a ticking bomb at his residence. Inside rested a single audio tape, allegedly containing recordings of his extramarital affairs, meticulously spliced together in the dark rooms of the federal government. The audio was a weapon, but the true lethality lay in the accompanying letter. Typed on a heavily redacted machine to obscure its federal origins, the document delivered an explicit, terrifying ultimatum. The greatest civil rights leader of the 20th century was given exactly 34 days to commit suicide before the tape hit the press. The state was actively trying to force a high-profile casualty without leaving a fingerprint. This package was not a spontaneous act of malice. It was the explosive payload at the end of a grueling 5-year surveillance marathon. The operation against King consumed thousands of federal man-hours, draining immense taxpayer resources. Agents in headphones logged every single domestic flight, documented every hotel check-in, and transcribed every private conversation. He was living inside a panopticon constructed by his own government. To the operative sweating in the van, the reality of the mission becomes an unbearable weight. You realize you are not hunting foreign spies or domestic terrorists. You are systematically dismantling a man's sanity. The psychological warfare doctrine demands total isolation of the target. If the threat cannot be broken by blackmail alone, you must strip away his support systems, his allies, and his ability to survive. The assault immediately expanded from his bedroom to his bank account. The Bureau launched a scorched earth campaign to enact a total economic embargo on one man. Field agents actively contacted prestigious universities, major national newspapers, and wealthy political donors. They did not arrive with badges. They arrived with meticulously forged documents designed to shatter his reputation and dry up his funding overnight. Speaking engagements were suddenly canceled. Critical alliances dissolved into suspicion and fear. This is the raw power of state-sponsored disinformation operating at terminal velocity. By poisoning the well of public trust, the government trapped their target in a suffocating economic blockade. He was fighting a ghost, bleeding out financial resources, while the phantom operatives tightened the noose with every intercepted phone call. This was never a passive intelligence-gathering mission. It was a kinetic, active measure campaign explicitly engineered to induce a catastrophic psychological breakdown. The subject was deemed a critical threat to national security, not because he wielded weapons, but because he wielded truth. In the eyes of the surveillance state, a peaceful march on the Capitol is indistinguishable from a military siege. Both must be crushed. I have seen the aftermath of artillery strikes, but the wreckage detailed in these files is far more insidious. The devastation is internal. You do not see the crater. You only see a human being slowly collapsing under the sheer, invisible gravity of state persecution. The operative in the van knows that every click of the tape recorder is another nail being driven into the coffin of American civil liberties. The sheer terror of realizing your own country has declared war on your mind is not an abstract concept. It is a documented, tactical reality. Look at the data scattered across these case files. Look at the thousands of sanitized reports proving the government deployed military-grade psychological operations against a peaceful citizen. The infrastructure of paranoia was refined in these hotel rooms and perfected for future generations. The 34-day countdown was a death sentence drafted in the bureaucratic halls of Washington. It failed to break him, but it established a terrifying precedent. The state learned exactly how to bypass the courts, how to bypass the press, and how to strike directly at the neurological core of a target. They realized that total control does not require handcuffs if you can manipulate a subject into destroying themselves. As the tape reels continue to spin in the darkness of the alley, the blueprint for modern authoritarianism is permanently etched into the magnetic film. The war on the individual has been successfully prototyped. But neutralizing a single leader is only the first phase of the doctrine. To truly secure the empire, the state must now scale this psychological weapon to infect entire movements, turning allies into executioners. To truly secure the empire, the state must scale this psychological weapon to infect entire movements, turning allies into executioners. You take the doctrine forged against a single civil rights leader, and you deploy it against the masses. This is the lethal transition from isolated psychological torture to the tactical sabotage of an entire generation. Disinformation becomes the new artillery. The battlefield is no longer a hotel room. It is the absolute destruction of trust itself. I stand in a damp, echoing garage where a chaotic printing press churns out stacks of grassroots flyers. The smell of cheap ink and wet paper is heavy in the air. This is the crude, beating heart of resistance. But 2,000 miles away, inside a sterile, climate-controlled federal laboratory, technicians in white coats are dissecting this exact flyer. They are meticulously analyzing the paperweight, the typography, the specific chemical signature of the ink. They are not preparing evidence for a trial. They are manufacturing a perfectly authenticated counterfeit, a weaponized forgery designed to ignite a lethal gang war. This is the weaponization of pure paranoia. When the state apparatus decides to annihilate a political faction, they do not bother with mass arrests. Arrests create martyrs. Instead, they manipulate the target into suspecting their own brothers and sisters of treason. They engineer an internal purge. You are watching a live-fire exercise in psychological warfare. If you want to break a resistance, you do not attack the perimeter. You inject a virus directly into its central nervous system. You make the frontline fighters believe the man standing next to them in the trenches is secretly feeding coordinates to the enemy. This systemic destruction of solidarity was not a rogue experiment. It was a heavily funded, meticulously documented federal directive. The primary tactical doctrine of this campaign was officially classified as snitch jacketing. Intelligence operatives utilized state-of-the-art forgery facilities to create perfectly authenticated documents, specifically designed to make it appear that a fiercely loyal activist was actually an undercover federal informant. They planted these lethal lies directly into the hands of the movement's most volatile leaders. It was a digital-era deepfake executed with analog precision. I have read the declassified routing slips. The bureaucratic detachment is absolutely chilling. An agent drafts a fake receipt for an informant payout, signs it with a forged signature, and drops it in the mail. With a single postage stamp, they effectively sign a death warrant for an innocent citizen. The activists tear themselves apart, desperately hunting for a traitor who does not exist. The state simply steps back and watches the movement cannibalize its own ranks. The fallout from these federal laboratories did not remain confined to paper. The forged ink bled directly onto the concrete. The front lines shifted from ideological debates to violent, chaotic street corners. In the year 1969, the Bureau targeted the Black Panther Party in Chicago. The strategy was brutally simple. Locate a heavily armed rival street gang, analyze their territorial disputes, and throw a federal match directly into the powder keg. Agents drafted a series of highly inflammatory, anonymous letters and mailed them back and forth between the Black Panther leadership and this rival Chicago street faction. These documents were specifically engineered by behavioral scientists and intelligence officers to insult, threaten, and provoke an immediate, lethal response. The United States government was actively masquerading as local gang members to explicitly incite an urban bloodbath. You must understand the sheer malice of this operation. The operatives drafting these death threats knew exactly what the kinetic outcome would be. They were not gathering intelligence to prevent a crime. They were aggressively choreographing a massacre. They utilized classified psychological profiles to identify the exact trigger words that would guarantee a violent retaliation. It was premeditated murder by proxy, orchestrated from behind a government typewriter. The operation was tragically successful. These forged letters resulted in actual, documented shootings and multiple deaths on the streets of Chicago. Urban neighborhoods were deliberately transformed into chaotic proxy war zones, meticulously managed and funded from federal desks in Washington. The state effectively hired unwitting citizens to execute their political targets, completely insulating the intelligence apparatus from the resulting body count. Blood pooled on the South Side while operatives in the Capitol filed their success reports in triplicate. I stand on these street corners today, and I still feel the phantom echoes of that engineered violence. The government played the role of a supreme puppet master, severing the strings of community solidarity with surgical precision. They turned marginalized neighborhoods into killing fields, and they paid for the ammunition with your tax dollars. When forged letters were not enough to trigger a collapse, operatives escalated to a physical technique known as bad jacketing. Federal agents conducted highly illegal, unauthorized black bag searches of activists' apartments in the dead of night. They did not break in to steal evidence. They broke in to plant fake intelligence reports, guaranteeing that when the target's allies inevitably found the planted documents, violent internal purges would tear the organization apart. This is the absolute inversion of law enforcement. They injected counterfeit reality into the private sanctuaries of American citizens. The sheer terror of realizing your own bedroom has been staged to frame you for treason against your own cause is paralyzing. The paranoia generated by these night raids shattered entire coalitions. No one could be trusted. Every misplaced file, every unannounced phone call became potential evidence of a fatal, engineered betrayal. The factionalism strategy worked flawlessly. Movements that had survived police batons and federal indictments completely shattered under the weight of their own manufactured suspicion. The Bureau successfully neutralized massive political organizations without ever putting an agent on the witness stand. They realized that the cheapest way to destroy a revolution is to simply hand the revolutionaries a loaded gun and a perfectly forged list of traitors. The state learned a vital, terrifying lesson in the blood-soaked streets of Chicago. Psychological warfare is infinitely more efficient than conventional tactics. But controlling the political fringe was only a proving ground. To maintain total hegemony, the surveillance apparatus had to expand its targets. They needed to silence the voices that possessed true, massive cultural power. The crosshairs shifted from the urban underground directly to the mainstream stage.
The crosshairs shifted. You step into a deafening arena in 1969. The floorboards shake under the weight of 10,000 screaming fans. The air smells of sweat, cheap weed, and raw electricity. But look past the blinding stage lights. Backstage, huddled in the claustrophobic shadows, a man in a sharply pressed suit raises a camera with a telephoto lens. He is not a fan. He is a hunter. And the man holding the microphone is his primary target. Through the viewfinder of that camera, the operative does not see an artist. He sees a highly effective insurgent. The music tearing through the amplifiers is not entertainment. It is an unguided acoustic missile. The crowd is a mobilized army waiting for a command. The state security apparatus looked at the terrifying, uncontrollable power of rock and roll and recognized a lethal threat. The culture war was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal, active combat zone. Why deploy federal assets against a man with a guitar? Because an activist speaking on a street corner can agitate 100 people. A rock star singing on national television can radicalize a generation in exactly 3 minutes. The bureaucracy realized that assassinating a political leader creates a martyr, but destroying a cultural icon severs the emotional spine of an entire movement. You have to ask yourself, how frightened must an empire be to declare war on a melody? The answer lies buried in the archives. I tracked down the declassified files, and the sheer volume of paranoia is staggering. The Bureau compiled a massive 300-page dossier on John Lennon alone. They analyzed his lyrics as if decrypting Soviet transmission codes. They categorized his anti-war anthems as a direct, kinetic threat to the administration. This was not a passive intelligence-gathering exercise. It was the foundation of a ruthless, 4-year campaign to deport him. They understood that a voice that loud could not simply be ignored. It had to be systematically muted. The operative snapping photos backstage is just one cog in a sprawling machine of cultural suppression. The strategy was to isolate the signal. If you cannot shoot the singer, you blow up the transmission tower. The federal government began treating the alternative press and independent broadcasters not as journalists, but as hostile enemy propaganda networks operating on domestic soil. The operations were purely tactical and blatantly illegal. Field agents infiltrated underground newspaper offices and independent radio stations under the cover of darkness. They did not come to gather evidence for a trial. They came to execute physical sabotage. They poured acid into printing presses. They slashed transmission cables with wire cutters in the dead of night. They were executing military-style disruption campaigns designed to plunge the counterculture into absolute silence. When you silence the printing presses and sever the radio antennas, the darkness spreads. The state realized that neutralizing the icons was only the first step. They had to map the entire ecosystem that consumed this culture. The scope of the battlefield rapidly expanded beyond the artists and the publishers. The crosshairs locked on to the audience itself. Every student holding a protest sign, every citizen attending a rally, suddenly became a node in a massive hostile network. The operation breached its final constitutional constraint. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined forces with the Central Intelligence Agency to launch a domestic dragnet codenamed Operation Chaos. Let the gravity of that collaboration sink in. Agencies strictly prohibited from turning their tools inward unleashed their combined weight on the American public. They illegally surveilled over 300,000 citizens
solely for their participation in the anti-war movement. 300,000 lives dragged into the shadow of the national security state. 300,000 teachers, students, and factory workers treated as enemy combatants. The dragnet was an indiscriminate vacuum. Your library records, your travel history, your private conversations, all indexed, cross-referenced, and weaponized. The infrastructure of total information awareness was being built in real time, decades before the first smartphone ever connected to a cellular tower.
We are looking at the exact blueprint of the modern surveillance state, forged in the fires of 1960s paranoia. If this staggering scale of state manipulation blows your mind too, hit the like button right now. To ensure you do not miss the solution to this terrifying historical mystery, subscribe to the channel. Do you think we stood a chance against an empire equipped with this level of unlimited power? Let me know in the comments. We are decoding your reality right here. But surveillance alone does not destroy a cultural figure. To neutralize an icon, you must annihilate their public credibility. The operatives knew that arresting a musician for singing a protest song violates the First Amendment. So they changed the battlefield. Cultural figures were systematically targeted for staged drug busts. Federal agents coordinated with local police departments to execute heavily armed tactical raids on their private properties at highly specific moments. The timing of these strikes was never random. The raids were meticulously synchronized with album releases or major public speeches, and the press was always waiting. The state weaponized the media, ensuring cameras were rolling as beloved artists were dragged out in handcuffs. It is a psychological masterstroke. You do not argue with their political message, you simply present them to the public as unstable criminals. You bury their influence under a landslide of manufactured scandal. The chilling effect swept through the culture like a winter storm. When the brightest voices of a generation are suddenly fighting felony charges and deportation orders, the music stops. The message fractures. Other artists see the smoldering wreckage of their peers' careers, and they step back from the microphone. They censor themselves. The government did not have to write a law banning dissent. They simply made the personal cost of speaking out too terrifying for anyone to endure. This was a silent, bloodless coup against the American mind. The state proved it could dismantle a massive cultural awakening using wiretaps, slashed cables, and flashbulbs. They had successfully contained the threat of the microphone. But the machinery of paranoia, once activated, cannot easily be powered down. The operatives, looking through the telephoto lenses, grew restless. Discrediting an enemy is effective, but it leaves them alive, and alive means they can still fight back. The threshold of violence was about to be crossed permanently. Sabotage and character assassination were no longer sufficient for a bureaucracy drunk on its own absolute power. The directives from Washington grew darker, demanding permanent solutions to temporary political problems. The shadow war was accelerating past the point of no return. The operatives were packing up their cameras and wire cutters, and they were loading live ammunition into their service weapons. The slaughter was imminent. The operatives were packing up their cameras and wire cutters, and they were loading live ammunition into their service weapons. The slaughter was imminent. We are standing in a dimly lit hallway of a West Side Chicago apartment building. The air is thick with plaster dust and the sharp metallic stench of cordite. The floor is covered in shattered drywall and brass shell casings. This is no longer a surveillance operation. This is a battlefield, and the state has declared total war. I'm looking at a wooden door that has been completely shredded by heavy-caliber gunfire. The camera tracks through the jagged splinters, following the violent trajectory of the bullets into the living room. There is something fundamentally wrong with this picture. The damage is entirely one-sided. There are no impact craters on the hallway walls. The anomaly is glaring, screaming at us through the silence of the debris. We are looking at a state-sponsored assassination. Up until this moment, the Bureau operated in the shadows. They ruined careers. They forged letters. They drove men to the brink of psychological collapse. But character assassination leaves the target breathing. And a breathing target can still rally a crowd. The directives from Washington mutated. The threat matrix escalated. If you cannot silence the microphone with a scandal or a drug bust, you permanently disconnect the speaker. The bureaucracy of paranoia demanded blood. The date is December 4th, 1969. The target is a 21-year-old Black Panther leader named Fred Hampton. He is a charismatic organizer, effectively uniting fractured communities across the city. To the Bureau, he is not a citizen. He is a highly infectious ideological pathogen. The raid happens in the dead of night. Heavily armed Chicago police officers storm the apartment, acting as the kinetic strike force for an intelligence operation coordinated from a federal desk. The officers do not kick down that door blind. They are operating with lethal precision, guided by an exact floor plan of the apartment. Every bedroom, every hallway, every piece of furniture is mapped out. This architectural intelligence was not gathered through a standard warrant. It was hand-delivered to the strike team by a paid FBI informant deeply embedded within Hampton's inner circle. The state weaponized a friend to draw the map that would guide the executioners to the target. I step through the ruined doorway into the master bedroom. The mattress is soaked in dark, arterial blood. The narrative pushed to the press hours later will describe a fierce, two-way gun battle with radical insurgents. But the physical environment contradicts the official report. The forensic architecture of the room tells a completely different, horrifying story. The walls are pockmarked with dozens of entry wounds, all angled inward from the doorway. There is no crossfire. The statistics of the aftermath are a chilling testament to the reality of the assault. Forensic evidence later proved that the police fired nearly 100 bullets into the confined space of the apartment. They emptied their magazines into the dark. In stark contrast, investigators found evidence of only a single, highly disputed shot fired from inside the residence. A ratio of 100 to 1 is not a firefight. It is a tactical slaughter designed to ensure zero survivors. Why didn't Hampton return fire? Why did a known militant leader, sleeping with weapons nearby, fail to defend himself as his front door was blown off its hinges? To find the answer, we have to look past the ballistics and examine the toxicology report. The anomaly lies in his bloodstream. The timeline of the evening reveals a calculated chemical sabotage orchestrated hours before the first battering ram ever struck the wood. The trap was set at the dinner table. The FBI informant did not just draw the map. He neutralized the primary target. Hampton was drugged with a massive, incapacitating dose of secobarbital, a heavy barbiturate, slipped into his drink during a late dinner. The state chemically paralyzed him. When the strike team breached the apartment, Hampton was deeply unconscious, effectively comatose. He was entirely defenseless when the officers entered his bedroom and shot him point-blank in his bed. They assassinated a sleeping man. I need you to understand the gravity of that tactical decision. The intelligence apparatus of the United States government utilized a civilian asset to poison a citizen, ensuring he could not wake up to invoke his constitutional right to a trial.
They bypassed the judicial system entirely. The badge and the gavel were replaced by a silencer and a body bag. The rule of law was violently suspended to eliminate a political inconvenience.
The blood on the floor is a direct result of paperwork. This was not a rogue police unit acting on a momentary surge of adrenaline. This hit was budgeted, approved, and celebrated by the chain of command. The violence was institutionalized. We have to follow the money trail back from the shattered apartment in Chicago to the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington. The true horror is the administrative calm that followed the gunfire. The informant who poisoned Hampton and provided the architectural blueprint for the raid was not arrested as an accomplice to murder. Instead, he was heavily compensated. The FBI paid him a massive cash bonus out of a completely secret, unaccountable slush fund. This taxpayer money was explicitly dispensed as a reward for the intelligence that directly led to the successful, lethal raid. The state literally cut a check to finance the assassination of a political dissident. This is the terrifying apex of COINTELPRO. The system proved it possessed both the capability and the absolute willingness to exterminate an American citizen on domestic soil without due process. If you think this level of extreme prejudice was locked away in 1969, you are fundamentally misjudging the nature of power. The capability to erase a target did not vanish. It simply evolved. The mechanics of the raid became a permanent blueprint for the security state. I look back at the bullet holes tearing through the plaster. Each one is a physical manifestation of a government terrified of its own people. When the state realizes it cannot control your mind with propaganda, it will inevitably resort to controlling your body with kinetic force. The Chicago raid crossed a sacred democratic threshold. They proved that if you become effective enough at organizing resistance, you will no longer be monitored. You will be actively hunted. But a bureaucracy leaves a paper trail. You cannot finance an assassination, pay an informant, and coordinate a multi-agency strike without generating a massive volume of classified documents. The arrogance of the Bureau was their absolute certainty that these files would never see the light of day. They believed the fortress was impenetrable. But out in the dark, desperate citizens realized that the only way to stop a rogue state was to steal its darkest secrets. The decision to steal those secrets is made in the shadow of the Chicago slaughter. You do not protest against a firing squad. You disarm it. It is a freezing night. Rain lashes against the windshield of a stolen getaway car. In the cramped back seat, a flashlight beam trembles over stolen manila folders. The adrenaline is suffocating. If they are caught with this paper trail, they face decades in a federal cage. The engine idles in the dark. Every passing headlight looks like a patrol cruiser. This is the front line of an invisible war. They have just executed a direct strike against the most heavily fortified intelligence apparatus on the planet. This is the analog hack. Before digital encryption leaks, before modern whistleblowers downloaded servers onto thumb drives, there was only a crowbar, a pair of leather gloves, and raw terror. We are in March 1971. The target is a small, seemingly insignificant FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. An activist group calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI has just breached the perimeter. They are not trained operatives. They are professors, students, and ordinary citizens who realized that the state is actively hunting them. They bypass the alarms with agonizing precision. They do not have flash drives. They have duffel bags and a ticking clock. The citizen investigators rip open filing cabinets,
stuffing every piece of classified intelligence they can carry into the canvas sacks. They escape into the damp night with over 1,000 classified documents. The weight of those papers is the weight of an empire's guilt. They are driving away with the absolute proof of an undeclared domestic war.
In the safety of the getaway car, the flashlight catches a stamped word on official government letterhead. It is a word no civilian has ever seen before. COINTELPRO. Counterintelligence Program. It is the master key to the nightmare. The documents detail the exact bureaucratic machinery that authorized the assassinations, the forged letters, and the psychological destruction of their friends. The ghost finally has a name. The realization hits them like a physical blow. They are holding the blueprints of the surveillance state in their trembling, rain-soaked hands. But possessing the truth is a lethal liability. The moment the Bureau discovers the breach, the entire weight of the federal government will crash down on them. They have crossed the Rubicon. They are no longer dissidents. They are the most wanted fugitives in the United States. By sunrise, the panic in Washington is absolute. The fortress has been compromised by amateurs. A massive nationwide manhunt is instantly authorized. Hundreds of federal agents flood the streets, locking down borders and tearing through neighborhoods. The Bureau operates on pure, terrified vengeance. They know that if these files reach the public, the illusion of their righteous authority will evaporate permanently. The manhunt is a dragnet designed to crush anyone caught in its teeth. But the citizens vanish into the underground. Their operational security is flawless. Despite the mobilization of the greatest investigative machinery on Earth, the identities of these burglars will remain a complete, impenetrable secret for over 40 years. They beat the system at its own game, hiding in plain sight while the empire burns around them. Now comes the most dangerous phase of the operation. You cannot simply hand stolen state secrets to the police. The citizen investigators systematically sort the files, package them, and anonymously mail the evidence to major newspapers across the country. They are throwing a live grenade into the newsrooms of America. They are forcing the press to choose between comfortable compliance and the terrifying truth. The packages arrive. The reaction is not immediate triumph. It is pure institutional fear. Several major publications look at the classified stamps and immediately panic. Some editors initially refuse to publish a single word. They return the stolen files directly to the FBI out of sheer terror of federal retaliation. The grip of the security state is so tight that even the free press is afraid to report on its crimes. You have to understand the chilling effect of this power. When the media is too terrified to report that the government is murdering its own citizens, the system is fully totalitarian. I watch the silence stretch, knowing the citizen investigators are waiting to see if their desperate raid was entirely in vain. The clock is ticking. The FBI is closing in. The truth is sitting in a mailroom, waiting for a spark. But the dam finally breaks. A single brave publication decides the public interest outweighs the threat of federal prism. The ink hits the paper. The stolen files are printed for the world to see. It is an explosive, catastrophic breach of the official narrative. The eventual, undeniable release of these documents permanently shatters the manufactured myth of the FBI's absolute integrity. The facade collapses completely. The release is a shockwave. For the first time, the paranoid suspicions of the public are validated by hard, stamped evidence. You were not crazy. The phones really were tapped. The infighting really was manufactured.
The assassinations really were authorized. The citizens in the getaway car have successfully exposed the beast. They've dragged the monster out of the dark archives and into the glaring light of day.
Look at the courage required for this strike. They had no backup. They had no legal protection. They risked their entire lives to hand you the manual of your own subjugation. This analog hack is the absolute blueprint for resistance. They proved that an untouchable bureaucracy is only as secure as the padlock on its basement door. The system can bleed. The state can be exposed by the very people it seeks to destroy. But exposing the war does not end the war. The files are out, but the machine is still running. The men who signed those assassination orders are still sitting in their comfortable leather-bound chairs in Washington. The public is outraged, but the security apparatus is preparing to fight for its survival. The citizens have lit the match, but now the fire is spreading rapidly toward the halls of Congress. The fire ignited in that Pennsylvania mailroom does not burn out. It races straight down the eastern seaboard and detonates inside the highest halls of power. It is 1975. I am watching a sprawling, oak-paneled Senate hearing room fill to absolute capacity. The air is thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the ozone of exploding camera flashes. Those flashes go off like artillery fire, blinding the men at the witness table. The shadow war has just been dragged into the light. Look at the faces of these high-ranking intelligence officials. These are the untouchables. The men who operated the levers of the machine from the safety of the dark. Now they are sweating under the brutal, unforgiving glare of television lights, forced to answer to the public they treated as enemy combatants. The monster is finally unmasked. But what actually happens when the hunters are dragged onto the stand? Does the beast surrender, or does it simply change its camouflage? The cataclysmic media leak from Pennsylvania triggered an unprecedented institutional panic. The government could no longer deny the blood on its hands. This shockwave forced the formation of the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations, famously known as the Church Committee. For the first time in American history, the legislative branch aims its crosshairs directly at the intelligence apparatus. It is a live-fire autopsy of a fundamentally compromised democracy. The men sitting behind those microphones are not facing a standard inquiry. They are facing a tribunal for an invisible civil war. The senators demanding answers are holding the very documents stolen in the dark of night. You can hear the tremor in the voices of the accused as they realize the chain of command can no longer protect them. Every single operational directive, every illegal wiretap authorization, every black bag job is being read aloud into the permanent congressional record. The findings are completely devastating. When the dust finally settles on the hearings, the committee releases a massive final report. It concludes unequivocally that domestic intelligence agencies had conducted a sophisticated, illegal vigilante operation against their own citizens. The FBI was not defending the Republic. It was fundamentally violating the Constitution. The very agency tasked with enforcing the law was operating as the most prolific criminal syndicate in the entire country. Let that sink into your tactical awareness. The term vigilante is not mine. It is the exact word used by the United States Senate. They officially recognized that the state security apparatus went completely rogue. The directors of these agencies bypassed every check and balance, acting as judge, jury, and executioner. They turned the homeland into a battlefield, treating teachers, civil rights leaders, and musicians as hostile insurgents who needed to be neutralized at any cost. but the sheer volume of the betrayal is what freezes the blood. The investigations revealed a breathtaking perimeter of surveillance. The FBI had systematically accumulated over 500,000 domestic intelligence files on American citizens. 500,000 lives categorized, tracked, and targeted. And here is the truly terrifying part. These individuals had committed 0 crimes. They were placed on hit lists and watch lists based absolutely and solely on their political beliefs. 500,000 files. That is not a targeted investigation. That is a dragnet, designed to capture the entire ideological spectrum of a nation. If you attended a rally, if you wrote an anti-war editorial, if you simply associated with the wrong demographic, your name was typed onto a federal index card. The state weaponized its bureaucracy to criminalize the First Amendment. It proves that institutional paranoia is an endless hunger. Once the machine starts feeding, it cannot stop. I watched the flashbulbs erupt again in the hearing room, capturing the sweat dripping from the chins of the intelligence directors. They are desperately trying to justify the unjustifiable. They use words like national security and subversion to dress up their crimes in the language of patriotism. But the senators are not buying it, and neither is the public watching on live television. The carefully constructed armor of the federal government has been shattered by hard, irrefutable data. The political survival instinct kicks in. The establishment realizes it must do something to quell the rising tide of absolute public fury. This devastating fallout directly leads to the implementation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, in 1978. It is branded as a massive reform, a desperate legislative attempt to place heavy legal chains on a previously unrestrained security apparatus. The government promises that the era of unchecked spying is over. But as a war correspondent, I know better than to trust a peace treaty drafted by the aggressors. FISA establishes a secret court, a shadow tribunal, where judges meet behind closed doors to approve surveillance warrants. They tell you it is oversight, but oversight conducted in absolute secrecy is just another black box. The chains they placed on the beast were not made of iron, they were made of rubber. The architecture of the surveillance state is not dismantled, it is merely legalized. The church committee hearings give the public a fleeting sense of victory. The villains are publicly shamed, laws are passed, and the immediate threat seems neutralized. But the underlying infrastructure, the massive centralized database of human behavior, the capacity for instant communication intercepts, remains fully intact. The government did not destroy the weapon. They simply learned how to hide it better. They realized that physical files and rogue agents are a severe liability. The true horror of 1975 is not what they found in the past. It is what it unleashed for the future. The intelligence community learned a critical, terrifying lesson from this public execution. They realized that to maintain total control, they could never be caught breaking in again. They needed a system where you would willingly hand over your data, where the wiretap is something you gladly pay for. The analog war is over. The digital slaughter is just about to begin. The analog war is over, but as I stand in the freezing hum of a modern data center in the year 2026, I realize the silence is deceptive. This is the new front line. The physical battlefields of the 1960s, the smoke-filled rooms and blood-stained apartments, have been completely scrubbed clean. The storm has passed, and the survivors went home thinking the beast was dead. But the state security apparatus did not surrender. They merely went subterranean.
We thought the church committee was our definitive victory parade, but it was nothing more than a tactical retreat by an enemy that operates on infinite time. They realized that physical files and rogue field agents breaking into Pennsylvania offices were unacceptable liabilities. The old tactics were too loud, too messy, and left too many casualties in plain sight. They needed a system so deeply embedded in our daily lives that we would never even think to look for a wiretap again. This brings us to the terrifying ghost in the machine. The sheer logistical nightmare of assigning a human agent to listen to your phone calls is a relic of the past. They no longer need to deploy an undercover operative in the dead of night to break into your house and plant a microphone. The necessity for physical surveillance has been entirely replaced by a brilliant, insidious strategy: your own voluntary data surrender. Look at the device you are holding right now. You carry a highly advanced geolocation and audio recording device with you at all times. You sleep with it inches from your head. You pay a premium for it, and you gleefully hand over the intimate details of your psychology every single time you touch the screen. The government did not defeat the insurgency. They simply convinced every citizen to act as their own dedicated, unpaid informant. The analog tactics of forgery, misdirection, and psychological sabotage pioneered during the bloodiest days of COINTELPRO were never abandoned. They have seamlessly evolved into modern algorithmic manipulation. The enemy no longer needs a typewriter to draft a fake letter. They analyze your digital footprints in milliseconds. They map your fears, your desires, and your political leanings to predict and control your behavior with terrifying precision. What they did to Martin Luther King Jr. with anonymous suicide packages, what they did to the Black Panthers with planted informants, they can now execute against entire populations with the push of a button. The culture war is a literal war, and it has moved directly into our digital nervous system. The state does not need to manufacture a gang war in Chicago when they can spark a civil war in your news feed, weaponizing paranoia on a mass scale. The history of the counterintelligence program proves a devastating, undeniable law of geopolitical gravity. Unchecked institutional paranoia inevitably turns inward. Once a security state is granted the power to operate outside the Constitution in the name of safety, it ceases to view the public as a population to be protected. Instead, it begins to treat ordinary citizens as an active, hostile insurgency that must be perpetually managed and neutralized. This is the true, lingering fallout of the shadow war. We allowed the government to build an unstoppable machine to fight monsters in the dark, but the machine eventually became the monster. The clear lines between a foreign battlefield and your private living room have been permanently erased. The casualties of this new digital conflict will not be counted in bullet-riddled doors, but in the silent, invisible surrender of our fundamental free will. Understanding this dark, buried chapter of our history is no longer just an academic exercise in a university classroom. It is an absolute, non-negotiable survival mechanism. We are living in an era where lethal information warfare is waged quietly, invisibly, and constantly against us all. You cannot defend yourself against an enemy you refuse to see, and ignorance of this bureaucratic death squad is your greatest vulnerability today. We have spent this hour mapping the minefield together, pulling the classified blueprints out of the ashes to understand the mechanics of betrayal. If you want to survive the digital crossfire, you must study the history that built it. Subscribe to this channel, leave your conclusions in the comments below, and hit the like button to confirm that we are not fighting alone. Standing with this community is your first line of defense against the machine. The storm of the 1960s never truly passed. It just migrated into the cloud. The intelligence apparatus realized that the ultimate, foolproof form of control is not a violent raid in the middle of the night, but a digital cage you gladly lock from the inside. We survived the first wave, but the real war for your mind is happening right now in the dead silence of your screen. The trap is already set. Stay vigilant. I am signing off.